You might remember that during the 1870s, just after the Civil War ended, black political leaders such as Robert B. Eliot were elected to government positions. Eliot was first elected to the South Carolina legislature and eventually to the federal legislature, also known as Congress. And Eliot wasn't alone. During Reconstruction, several black politicians were elected to Congress and many more to state governments. They were the first black Americans to become lawmakers, and they were elected because large numbers of black people voted. But over time, black voters found it more and more difficult to cast their votes. States used voter suppression tactics, such as reading tests or poll taxes, to prevent poorer or less educated people from voting. Such laws targeted black voters specifically, and many included a loophole called a grandfather clause, which exempted voters whose grandfathers were eligible to vote. This may have been helpful to poor or illiterate whites, but it was of little use to black voters whose grandfathers had been enslaved. As a result of these voter suppression laws, states with the highest black populations often had the fewest registered black voters. In Mississippi, for example, black people made up nearly half the population, but only 5% of registered voters. Black activists knew that without voting rights, they would never be able to make meaningful change. So in the early 1960s, many turned their attention to this issue. One of the first was Robert Moses, a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Moses traveled to Mississippi to register black voters, but he had limited success. He was beaten by police and jailed, and after a month, he had managed to register only 6 new black voters. Attempts to enfranchise black voters were often met with violence. In September 1961, an NAACP activist named Herbert Lee, who had been working with Moses, was shot and killed for his efforts to register black voters in Mississippi. Moses left the state, having registered only 24 new voters. 3 years later, while Congress was debating the Civil Rights Act, a larger protest movement gathered in Mississippi to demand voting rights. Known as the Mississippi Freedom Summer, it was a voter registration drive of unprecedented scope. Many of the young activists who participated were inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer, an outspoken advocate of voting rights, who was famous for singing rousing hymns like This Little Light of Mine. Fannie Lou Hamer also helped found a new branch of the Democratic Party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Her political organizing had a profound impact on the movement to win full voting rights for African Americans. The following year, after the Civil Rights Act had been signed into law, Dr. King and SNCC leader John Lewis focused their attention on voting rights in nearby Alabama, which, like Mississippi, had extremely restrictive voter suppression laws and low black voter registration. Dr. King led a protest march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. The most famous moment from the march has come to be called Bloody Sunday, when demonstrators were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge and were brutally attacked by police. But just as they had in previous years, the protesters' nonviolent tactics proved effective, and on August 6th of that year, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which made it a federal crime to attempt to stop any American citizen from exercising their right to vote. The effectiveness of these protests in the 1960s can be seen in the increase in registered black voters in states such as Mississippi and Alabama. Great progress had been made toward building a more equitable country, but white resentment and rage had also been triggered, and soon more violence would erupt.